Today's daf is Chulin daf Yud Aleph. Now we are 23 lines from the bottom of daf Yud Amid Beis Minaha Milsa da Amar Rabbanan. Today's daf is being learned as a schus before Shalema for Eliezer Yeshaya ben Brach. So I feel like we've been saying this a lot lately, but today's daf requires an asterisk. We mentioned it on daf Beis, on daf Vav, on daf Ches. It's equally, if not more true, for Chulin daf Yud Aleph. As a matter of fact, Chulin daf Yud Aleph is in the conversation of the most yesoidistic daf in Shas. What's the topic? It's the laws of Chazaka and the laws of Roiv. Now, why are we talking about Chazaka and Roiv? So if you take a look at Rashi, Betchilas HaSugya, Rashi says it's based on the fact that some of the halachas that we mentioned over the last two dafin relied very much on Chazaka. Specifically, on daf Tes Amud Aleph, the Gemara brought Rav Huna's memra, which said, Behema b'chayea, b'cheskas Isrei medes, ad sheyivad alecha b'man nishcheta. Nishcheta harei b'cheskas heter, ad sheyivad alecha b'man nitchafa. This halacha was melavas for a daf plus. It's predicated on the concept of chazaka. As a matter of fact, you see in Rav Huna's halacha that we rely on chazaka both lahachmer and lahakel. Behema b'chayeh b'cheskas iser, there's something called chazaka l'chumra. Nishchata harei b'cheskas heter, there's something called chazaka l'kula. Obviously, this is not the only place in Shas that you find the idea of Chazaka. But at the same time, it featured prominently right here in the last two dafin, and it's for that reason, Zok Tehillah Gerashi, the Gemara feels this is a good place to digress a little bit, take a few steps back, and discuss a little bit, Minaha Milsa da Amar Rabbanan, Oikim Milsa Chazaka. Now, that explains why the Gemara is going to talk about Chazaka. But as we're going to see, it's two lines from the top of Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. In the middle of the daf, the Gemara is going to say, Minaha Milsa da Amar Rabbanan Zil Basa Ruba. Chazaka we're talking about because that was a major part of the last two daf, and specifically Rav Huna's memra and daf Tes. But Roiv didn't seem to be featured disproportionately in these last Gemaras than it is in so many other places. So I understand why we're discussing Chazaka, why we're talking about Roiv. So Rashi addresses the question on the top of daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, and Rashi says, Aidi da'ayri b'minaha milsa de Chazaka, nakanamiha. Once we're talking about what's the makar to Chazaka, we might as well talk a little bit about what's the makar to Roiv as well. So according to Rashi, this epic sugya of Chazaka and Roiv, the sources of Chazaka and Roiv, that is the topic of Chulin daf Yud Aleph. It's really behemshech to Rav Huna's memra on daf Tes. Rav Huna's memra was very much negay the laws of Chazaka, and the Gemara felt kan hamakoim to shtel sich a little bit to talk about what is the makar to Chazaka. Once we mention what the makar to Chazaka is, may inyan le-inyan very much, but it's inyan, we also talk a little bit about what the makar to Roiv is. Now, Rashi's mahalach, in terms of explaining why we're discussing Roiv, that it's all derech, agav of Chazaka, Kemuvin is a little dachak, because it's true, Roiv and Chazaka very much are bound by the hip. But there are other very important ideas that come to the party that Roiv and Chazaka attend. For example, there's an idea called Karoiv. There's a concept of Migu, Eidim, Eidechad. What's the tzad hashava of all the aforementioned? These are all oifanim of how we machriya sveikis. So you want to tell me derech agav, because we're going to mention Chazaka, which has some shaykhis to the beginning of Maseches Chulin, we're also going to mention Roiv. Well, why stop after Roiv? Why didn't the Gemara say Minaha Milsa da Amar Rabbanan Zil Basa Karoiv? By the way, Karv's a big deal. There's a whole sugi in Bava Basra, Roiv v'Karoiv. Which one is Adif? Or why don't we say Minaha Milsa da Amar Rabbanan, that there's a concept of Migu b'makom Chazaka, Migu b'makom Roiv. Right? All these ideas come together. Kemuvin, what Rashi is saying, although it's the Pshutei Shal Mikra in the Sugya, is a little bit dacha. If you take a look at the Chedushei Aran in the Sugya, the Ran says differently. The Ran says that just like in Rav Huna's memra, we saw the idea of Chazaka, in Rav Huna's memra, we saw the idea of Roiv as well. Why? What did Rav Huna say? Behema b'chayea b'cheskas Isrei medes ad she'yivadol l'cha b'men nishchata. That's chazaka. So if you have a suffix right now in a shchita, it's pashit that the behema is going to be awesome. Why? Because before the shchita, the behema was awesome. Machlekes Rashi and Tosfos. Is it the Isser Eva Menachai, or is it the Isser Eino Zavuach? But at the end of the day, it was for sure B'chazkas Isser. Thus, you see the concept of Chazaka. What was the seif of Rav Huna? Nishchata, once you do the Shchita, Harehi B'chazkas Heter, it's for sure Mutter, Ad She'yivada L'cha B'men Nitshfa. Meaning, once there was a Shchita, if now it was Noilad Asafik, maybe the animal was a Treifa, so the animal is considered to be B'chazkas that it wasn't a Treifa. Freik the Ran, Mechatese. Where's the Chazaka that it wasn't a Treifa? Maybe it was a treifa, and if it was a treifa, the shechita was never really materid. And if that's the case, what does it mean? Nishchata harei b'cheskas het. Zok Ran, what's the teretz? It's because roiv behemoths are not treifas. Being that roiv behemoths are not treifas, therefore, once you do the shechita, the animal's b'cheskas, that it's mutter ba'achila, and therefore, if it's noilad a suffix now, you're going to have a chazaka. But at the end of the day, that chazaka Zok Ran is rooted in the fact that roiv animals are not treifas. If that's the case, Zok Ran in Rav Huna's halacha, you see sai the concept of chazaka, and you see sai the concept of roiv. That's why we're going to have a whole sugya here on Daf Yud Aleph. Again, with the Mahalach of Rashi, we're going back to Rav Huna on Daf Tes. But in Rav Huna Daf Tes, it's not just chazaka that we see Zok Ran. You see chazaka and roiv. Hence, we're going to have the sugya of Minah Milsa and the Amr Abanon. Oiki Milsa achazake and Minah Milsa the Amr Abanon zil basaru. Okay, so the daf, as we'll see, is going to be made up of two parts, not two equal parts. The first part is going to be Minah Milsa the Amr Abanon, Oiki Milsa achazake. The second is going to be Minah Milsa the Amr Abanon zil basaruba. So we have to be makdim a little bit. This is the second introduction to the idea of chazaka, and then Be'ezer Hashem, when we get up to the roiv part of the sugya, we'll do a tiny bit of an introduction to roiv as well. When we talk about the word chazaka, it can mean many different things. The chazaka of Rav Huna was where something was established to be a certain way based on facts. Now it was noilad a suffix that maybe that changed. There's a concept of the last time I knew for sure what the status of this was. It was a certain way. We assumed the status quo, and as a result, there's an idea of, if I'm not sure what's going on, just assume that it is the way it always was. That's a concept of chazaka that's known as chazaka de meikara. And this idea of chazaka de meikara, by the way, you find it from a physical perspective and you find it from a halachic perspective. So there's a chazaka de meikara that we assume that if the mikveh had 40 sa, it still has 40 sa. Or there's a chazaka de meikara that if a person physically was of a certain way, then probably that didn't change. There's also a concept of chazaka de meikara as it relates to halacha. If something was tahar or tameh, if something was mutter or aser, we are allowed to assume the status quo. That's the concept of chazaka de meikara. But the bottom line is the first category of chazaka, le'inyanenu, is what's known as chazaka de meikara. The second is what's known as cheskas umdana. Cheskas umdana is also referred to as chazaka, but it's a completely different inyan. Cheskas umdana is that we assume certain chazakas, we assume people behave a certain way. And that's something that is machriya halacha. So for example, chazaka ein adam peireya choyvay teichs manay, or chazaka ein adam meyes panav bifnei bal choyvay. That has nothing to do with chazaka de meikara. There's no meikara in this case. We have absolutely no idea, no information, but there's a certain norm that Chazal use the word chazaka to describe, and based on that norm, there's this concept of a cheskas umdana. Another concept of chazaka that you find is if something happens repeatedly, it establishes a chazaka. So for example, a shar that shtoises 3 times goes from being a shar tam to a shar mu'id. Ki yadu, it's a machlokes Rebbe and Reb Shimon Gamliel. How many times this pattern would have to repeat itself in order for chazaka to be established? Rebbe holds chazaka is b'shtayim, Rashbag holds that it's begimel, but that's also a word that is referred to as chazaka, but it's not a chazaka de meikara, it's not a cheskas umdana either. There's something called a cheskas kinyan, right? Karka, for example, is niknis bekesef shtar v'chazaka. That's a completely different Indian. Not al gadar or paratz, but again, you find the word chazaka. When you learn Masechtes Bava Basra, the third parak, cheskes habatim, so the word chazaka gets thrown all over the place. That's a cheskes raya. The bottom line is, there are a lot of different types of chazaka. As it relates to our sugya that we're about to learn, the chazaka that we're focusing on is the chazaka that Rav Huna was talking about on Naftas. And that is the concept of a chazaka de me'ikara. That Behema b'chayel is b'cheskas iser. We know for sure this animal was aser. Last time we verified. Now we have a suffix. Is it still aser or is it not aser? There's a concept of leave it the way it was. And that's something that works lahachmir. It's something that works lahakil. It's that type of chazaka that our Gemara is going to zero in right now and focus on. Over the years, we've mentioned several times a very important maramakim. It's in the Chasam Sofer Lashas. It's right here in Chulin Daf Yura Mid Beis, where the Chasam Sofer talks about different types of chazakas. A lot of this tiny introduction that we just mentioned comes from that maramakim. Ayin Sham, it's top 10 maramakim, really, for people that learn all the yeshiva sugyas in terms of really, in a very, very clear way, crystallizing the differences between the different types of ideas that we find described as a chazaka. Either way, we already had two introductions to today's daf. So without further ado, Zok the Heilige Gemara. What is the makar to this that the Rabbanon said? Oiki milsa achazake. It's interesting. You find very often in Shas this idea, Minaha milsa the Amar Rabbanon, or right, the idea, a lashon that the Rabbanon said this. Very often there's a shmuz. Does that mean that this is a Rabbanon diga halacha, or could minaha milsa the Amr Rabbanon be a deiraisa diga halacha? I think this Gemara is a raya berura that the word Amr Rabbanon doesn't necessarily mean that it's their chiddush, their creation, and that it's rabbinic in nature. It could be the Rabbanon were just telling you what state in Torah, but minaha milsat amar rabbanon, avad is not a din rabbanon. This is a din deiraisa. So what is the makar in the Torah to the idea of oiki milsa achazake? By the way, Chasam Sofer says even the words of the Gemara, oiki milsa achazake, just leave it as it was, meaning we're discussing here which type of chazaka, the chazaka the meikara. It's learned out from the following pasuk, and if you didn't know this may come as a shock, because really, if you were going to guess, this might be the last place in the Torah you would go to find the makar to the concept of chazaka the meikara. It says in the Torah, v'yotza kohen min habayis, el pesach habayis, v'hizkeres habayis shivas yom. So the context over here is where the bias had a nega. So we know a person can be a mitzayra, a beged can become a mitzayra, and a bias can become a mitzayra as well. The kohen is, of course, the authority of all things saras. You don't go to a doctor if you have saras. You went to the kohen if you had saras. Specifically, in this case, the kohen entered the house, and he saw that there was a nega. And based on what the Torah says he has to do, he has to close up the house for a week. He's going to inspect it in a week. He may have to close it for another week. And at some point, if it doesn't play out well, it's going to go from being a mitzayra musker to now a mitzayra muchlit. The bottom line is, we're discussing where the kohen entered the house, and he sees that there's a nega. Zok the Torah, he leaves the house, he goes to the Pesach Habayis, the Hizkres Habayis, and then he literally, Rashi says, closes the door, keeps it locked, Shivas Yamim, and when he's outside the bias, the Torah continues and says he declares it as being in a state of Tumah. It's not a state of Vadai Tumah, it's a state of Tumas Hesker. But the bottom line is, on some level, it's going to be Tameh. Fragt Reb Shmuel bar Nachmani in the name of Rabbi Yonasan. How do you understand this halacha? Maybe by the time the kohen left the house, at that point the shear of the nega was minimized a little bit. We saw what the shear is last week. It's a gris, but maybe it's not the same shear anymore. And if that's the case, it's not in a situation where it should become tameh. So how's it possible that the way the house becomes mitzayra, quote unquote, is when the kohen leaves the house, closes the door, and then determines it? it could be from the time that he saw it until he executed on it, the situation changed. Elalav must be. It must be because since the last time he saw it was a shear of a gris, so there's something called chazaka de meikar, and as a result, we leave it the way it is. Just explain this a little bit better. Bishloima, if the kohen was able to establish it as being a mitzvah while he's in the house, okay, so he's looking it between the eyes, he sees it, he not shrinking as a result, so he knows exactly what he needs to do. But being that the Torah says v'yotza koyim and abayis, Pesach abayis v'skres abayis shivas yomim, he has to first leave. Well, if that's the case, maybe by that point it's not this year anymore. Elamai must be there's a concept of oiki milsa achezake, but the Gemara says maskeflo Rav Acher bar Yaakov, and the names matter. Rav Acher bar Yaakov asked the Doma, I don't understand the raya. Maybe kigoin sheyotza derech hachorav. Maybe the way this works is the Kohen walks out with his back leading the way to so that he's able to see everything that's going on. Meaning, it sounds like this raya presupposes that this Kohen is going to leave the house the way people usually leave rooms. He's going to turn his back to the house and he's going to walk outside. But Mechatesi, that's what's happening. Maybe he's going to be Yotza Derech HaChayev, like this he's going to be able to see. But Enechanami, if he doesn't see it, he won't be able to establish it as it being a nega. And the reason is because maybe you don't go Basa Chazaka. Abaya told Rav Acher bar Yaakov, Shtei Tshuvas B'davar. I have two problems with what you just said. Number one, the Yitzia Derech HaChayev Lo Shma Yitzia. The Torah says V'yotza, and it has to mean that you're going in the regular way. We always speak out from Rabbi Chanan that whenever the Torah says something, the taich is to do it in the normal way, right? That's why if somebody eats shaleiki derech achila, it's not called achila, because when it says achila, it means a regular achila. Yitzia means in the regular way. If somebody would leave, derech achayev lo yishma yitziv. And besides, at the end of the day, he's going to have to close the door, right? So when he closes the door, he could be going out this way or that way. It doesn't matter how he's going, go sideways. But Lamaisa, once he closes the door, to the extent that it's behind the door, how is he going to see it? Now, if it's not behind the door, maybe he'll tell me he'll see it through a window. I don't know. But if it's behind the door for sure is closed off, right? So how's he going to see it if it's achari adelas? Elamai, it's muchach. There's no question in the world that you see from here that there must be a concept of chazak. Now, Abaye continued and he said, you'll tell me the pasuk beikavsa. Maybe in a situation where the nega is behind the door, before the kohen's going to leave, he's going to make a window inside the door. Meaning, usually the door shouldn't have a window, but in this situation, in order for him to be able to execute it, that's what he's going to do. So like this, he'll see it. Meaning, the only time you're ever going to be able to establish a bias as being a mitzayra is in the event that he sees it. What happens if it's a chari adelas? There it is. In that situation, you're going to open a little bit of window. But Abaye said that's not possible, because for Tanan it's a Mishnah. Bias ofel, in the event that there's a dark house, and when the kohen walks in, he can't see it, right? This is before the light bulbs. You're not allowed to open up any windows. Lira says nigoy, to see the nega. Rashi says it's learned out from the pasuk, kinega nirali baboyas, leave aloy la'oiri. But the bottom line is, you see you're not allowed to open up windows, so that can't be the Eitzah. So, Zokt Abaye, Shtei Tshuvas B'davar. Number one, you're asking a kasha that what? Maybe he's going out backwards. Yitzia, in that way, is not Yitzia. And besides, it wouldn't even help you in the event that it's Achari Adelas. And don't tell me you're going to open a window, because we know it's a Mishnah. That's not an option. Amalei Rava, so Rava turned to Abaya. And he told Abaya that you had Shtei Tshuvas and Rav Acher bar Yaakov. I'm not asking to either one. This that you're saying that Yitzia, Derech HaChayev is not called the Yitzia. It's not true. Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim yochiach. You see from the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, the Chsiv Beikos, it says by him the word Yitzia. It says v'yotza v'otza es oilasa. It's talking about when he was leaving the Kodesh HaKadosh. But tonight we learned in the Mishnah Masechtas Yuma Yotza b'alei derech tinsasai, that the way the Kohen Gadol used to walk out of the Kodesh HaKadoshim is the way upgit and eat and walk out of a bis medrash. Right? You don't turn your back to the Aron Kodesh. The Kohen Gadol is not turning his back to the Aron, to Lufnai v'Lufnim. So you see clearly it says in the Torah v'yotza, yet for sure Chazal say he went derech nisas, which means he went derech achor. Udika amrin, and regarding the other taina, Rava told Abaya, and that is that even if he went derech achorav, what are you going to do if it's achori adelas? And don't tell me he's going to open up a window. Why not? Because the Mishnah says bayis afal ein poischen by chaloinos. That's not a tzustal. Bayis afal ein poischen chaloinos liris nigay. Although it's true, you're tining that there's such a Mishnah of a hani really knowing that's true. Hechatli is chazek. That's if you don't know if there was ever a nega, if there was not a nega. So b'chai gavno there's such a halacha. But hechat is chazek. But to the extent that we know that at one point there was for sure a nega, and now we're just trying to determine whether it went away or whether it spread or it didn't spread. The bottom line is, Rav Acher bar Yaakov had a kasha on the Makar of Chazakah's being from the parasha of Negan. Abaye had state shuvas on the kasha of Rav Acher bar Yaakov. Rava knocked out Abaye's taina, which means that he's really reinvigorating Rav Acher bar Yaakov's kasha, right? So that's what we're holding. Where we're holding is Rav Acher bar Yaakov asked the kasha. Abaye said shtei tshuvas b'dava, but Rava knocked it out. So at the end of the day, what do we have? What we have is Rav Acher bar Yaakov's Greisa Kasha. Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani Amar Rabbi Yonasan said that what's the makar to the concept of Chazaka? It's learned out from Nigei Batim, Maskefla Rav Acher bar Yaakov, V'duma Kagan Shayotza Derech HaChayrav. Right, that's essentially where we are. Zok the Gemara stating that Tanya the like Rav Acher bar Yaakov. We have a Mefurish Braisa, not like Rav Acher bar Yaakov. The pasuk says V'yotza HaKoyin min habayis. And what's the hemshech of the pasuk? It says El Pesach habayis. The hisker es habayis shivas yom. Now, from the fact that it says, you would think that the person should go all the way to his own house and then he can do it. No, Talmud Loimer el Pesach habayis. He can't go home, right? The kohen, when he leaves, can't go home, have lunch, and then no. You leave El Pesach habayis. That's where this happens. You would think he should literally be underneath the mashkoif, right? He should literally be in the doorway. Talmud Loimar, it says min habayis. Ad sheyetze min habayis kulei. Haketzad. So what is it? Meaning it's a little bit tricky just from reading the pasuk. It says v'yotza hakoyin min habayis, which means he leaves the entire house, but then it says he goes al Pesach habayis. It sounds like he's still somewhat in the house. At the very least, he's in the Pesach habayis. Says the Braisa. Let me tell you how this works. Oymei betzad mashkev. He stands right next to the mashkev umasker, and then he goes ahead and he does the skira. So you want to know the real way of how this skira is supposed to take place. It's supposed to be as mentioned. Uminayin zok the Braisa shem halach l'toich beisoy v'hisker. That in the event that he went to his house and then he did the hisker, or if he stood in the bayis, or some have the gersi, he stood underneath the mashkef. How do you know in all these cases that it works? The Torah says the words v'hisker as habayis after v'yotza koyim and habayis pesach habayis. It says the word habayis again. That's how the Rishonim are mefarish. That's an extra word to teach me that doesn't matter where he did it. At the end of the day, it's going to be okay. But what do you see from here? What's the Tanya, the like Rav Acher bar Yaakov? You see with first that if he would go home and he would do it, it would be okay. Rav Acher bar Yaakov said, maybe we don't go basa chazaka. And maybe he has to see it. How's he going to see it? He's going to go backwards. What if it's a chayra adelis? You'll make a window. The Mishnah that says you can't do it, that's when you don't know if there was ever a neg. But once you know there's a neg, maybe at that point you're allowed to open up a window. Yeah, but what are you going to do with this brisa? This brisa says you can be home. And what if he lives on the other side of the neighborhood? I feel it's going to be okay. How's he going to answer this? Maybe where the kohen knows for a fact that it's okay. There's going to be a whole assembly line of people that are going to say, it's still good, it's still good, it's still good. I'm going to call him on the phone. I'm going to, whatever. We'll figure out a way to make sure he knows. But enachinami, if he doesn't know about it, it's not going to be okay. Meaning all the brisa is being mechadish is he doesn't have to be literally betzad mashkef. If he's in the bias, b'di'evet, it's fine. If he's underneath the mashkef, b'di'evet, it's fine. If he's in his own bias, b'di'evet, it's fine. You have a kasha if he's in his own bias, he doesn't know what's going on. No, kagan, we'll make up a mashal, the kaim midar, the garvi. There's a row of people and they're telling him exactly what happened. But at the end of the day, from Azak Kasha, start manish. If an Azak Kasha, we're definitely not going to knock out Rav Acher bar Yaakov. It's interesting. If you think about what we just learned, which by the way, concludes the Chazaka part of today's daf, until the raid that is. But if you think about what we just learned, so we had a makar to the idea of Chazaka. It's learned out from the parasha of Nigei Batim. Rav Acher bar Yaakov came and he asked a Groisa Kasha. Abaye tried defending it. Rava says, I don't agree with your defense. Nothing more about a Braisa that was not like Rav Acher bar Yaakov. But the Gemara seemed to reject that as well, meaning Rav Acher bar Yaakov is still standing, which really would leave us with Adam Makar, right? Doesn't it sound that way? If you learn the Gemara, just pashit, it sounds like we had a havamin of a Geshmak Makar, but at the end of the day, Rav Acher bar Yaakov seemed to have knocked it out, stating that at the end of the day, the makar to chazaka is Chulin daf Yud Amud Beis. It is the parsha of Nigei Batim. It's these words: V'dilma adenafik v'asa batzalei sheyuga elalab mishum damrin and oikra chazaka. So as much as in the cheshbon of the Gemara, you don't see it necessarily, but this is the way it is. There's another takeaway that's very, very important that needs to be mentioned, and that is, if you take a look at Rashi Dibra Maschel Tanya the Leiker of Acher Bar Yaakov. It's 4 lines from the bottom of Daf Yud Amud Beis. Zok Taylor Rashi. Tanya the Leiker of Acher Bar Yaakov. Who said what? Who asked the kasha on Rav Shmuel Bar Nachmani Amar Rabbi Yonasan, who had a problem with this being the makar to chazaka. Rashi says very sharp. Rashi who says that we don't rely on chazaka by nigei batim. Sounds a little bit from Rashi, that Rashi is saying that the takeaway of the sugya is that Rav Acher Bar Yaakov doesn't hold of chazaka. Now it only sounds a little bit that way, it's not muchach, because you could say what Rashi means to say is that there's no hechrach, that the way the parish of Nigei Batim works is with chazaka. But if you take a look at Rabbeinu Gershom on the side of the Gemara, Rabbeinu Gershom, Dibra Maschel, Rav Acher Bar Yaakov says, Rav Acher Bar Yaakov does not hold of the concept of chazaka. That's a dover nifla. As a matter of fact, if you take a look at Tosfos on the top of Yud Aleph on the base, Dibra Maschel Minoha Milsa, it's the second Tosfos. Tosfos over there, we'll speak out the Tosfos later, but in Tosfos it's mavur that according to Rav Acher Bar Yaakov, who didn't agree with the source of Rav Shmuel Bar Nachmani Amar Rabbi Yonasan that we learn chazaka from Nigei Batim, he's going to have to hold that the makar to chazaka is halacha l'Moshe Misinai. But don't walk away from the sugya thinking that Rav Acher Bar Yaakov doesn't hold of chazaka the makar. And really, at first glance, it sounds like there's a machlokes rishonim right here on the page. We didn't even go to the kovetz yet, but right here on the page, today's daf needs a kovetz. It sounds like there's a machlokes rishonim whether or not Rav Acher Bar Yaakov Shnita is that avada this chazaka narvas, you learn it from somewhere else, or it could be there's an Amir in the world whose name is not Rav Acher Bar Rava. His name is Rav Acher Bar Yaakov, who holds that there's no such thing as a chazaka. It's kamat mefurish from Rabbeinu Gershom. It's very mashma that way in Rashi. Tosfos state mefurish not that way. By the way, I'm b'marshon that Tosfos if you want to see it a little bit better. But the bottom line is this is something that we need to get back to, and be'ezer Hashem we will. Either way, we now turn our attention to the second and somewhat longer part of today's daf, and that is Minaha Milsa da Amar Rabbanon Zil Basa Ruba. So another one of the halachos revachos b'Yisrael is the concept of roiv. And just like chazaka, the word roiv means different things in different sugyas. So for example, there's a concept of roiv which says that if I have a suffix, so I could always assume that the roiv is correct. For example, if you have a bezdin and some dayanim see it this way, other dayanim see it another way, so we have a right to assume that whatever the majority believes, that's probably the way it is. Similarly, if I have something in front of me, I don't know where it came from, I have a right to assume that it probably came from the roiv. What's known as kol de parish, Meruba Parsh. So there's an idea of roiv where I have a suffix in front of me right now. So if I know the roiv is a certain way, that gives me a gerecht to assume that way. That idea of roiv, by the way, comes in 2 forms. It could wear 2 hats. It could be a ruba de isa kaman, or it could be a ruba de leisa kaman. Ruba de isa kaman is where I see the roiv. I'm looking at it. I see the bezdin shalchav gimel. I see Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. I'm looking at each one. And I see the ones that are saying Zaka, I see the ones that are saying Chayiv. But whoever the roiv is, I'm looking at them. Or the classic case of roiv throughout Shas that will be introduced to in 1 second, and that is I find a piece of meat, and there were Tesha Chanuyos. There were 9 Chanuyos in the store that sold kosher meat, and one of them that sells non-kosher meat, where I'm allowed to assume that this meat came from one of the Tesha Chanuyos, not from the one based on the concept of called the Parsh Meruba Parsh. Again, that's a situation where I see all the Chanuyos, and as a result, that's a Ruba de Isa Kaman. This type of roiv could also come in the flavor of a Ruba de Leisa Kaman. So for example, if there's a child, and we have a suffix, is this child a saris, if he's a boy, or an islandess, or if she's a girl? Most people are not srisim. or islandnesses. Thus, there's an idea of going basar. Now, over there, you don't see the ruba da alma that are not sarisim or they're not islandnesses, but afilu there's an idea that you go basar even when I don't have the roiv in front of me. That's what's known as ruba da leis kaman. But the two roivs are really one and the same, and that is an idea that I'm allowed to assume roiv. There is a huge nuance between where the roiv is isa kaman versus where the roiv is lesa kaman. There's another concept of roiv, and that is bittul b'roiv. So if I have a taruvos, a tipas basar falls into a kteras basar, a tipas chala falls into a kteras basar. So there's an idea of bittul b'roiv. The davar mu'at is battle to the davar roiv. Halacha revachi b'Yisrael. How many sugis and shas befrat and our Masechta Chulin deal with this idea? And there's a concept that's known as bittul b'roiv. There's another idea of roiv, and that is rubai kekulai. So where Chazal say that you have to do something, or you're not allowed to do something, do I have to do all of it? Or as long as roiv is there, if I have roiv, Rashisha Mispalalim, so to speak, that would be Ki'ilu. I have the entire thing. So again, just like Chazaka, there are many different types of roivs. The Gemara now is going to ask, Minaha Milsa, the Amr Abanan Zilba Saruba, which roiv are we discussing? We're discussing not bittul b'roiv, that we're going to get to. We're discussing not rubai kekulai. That's primarily a sugya mesechtas nazir from all places. What we're discussing over here is the idea that when there's a suffix, when in doubt, we're machriyas fakis based on assuming that whatever happened is in line and consistent with the majority. It's the idea of roiv being mevaris fakis, and again, without further ado, zok the heilige Gemara. What is in the Makarta? This that the Rabbanan said, Zil Masaruba, fake the Gemara Minalan. Seriously, did I hear right? Did I hear right? You're not sure what the Makarta roiv is? The Chsiv, it says Achrei Rabim Lahatis. When we learned Chazaka, it was a little bit of a sugya because the Torah doesn't say Chazaka anymore. But Achrei Rabim Lahatis is a pasuk in the Torah. What's Achrei Rabim Lahatis? If a Bezdin convenes and there's a dispute amongst the Dayanim, so you assume the roiv. But the point is, it's a Mefurish pasuk. Zakti Gemara. Ruba the Isa, come on. Where the roiv is in front of me, I can stare at the roiv. Kigoin Teisha Chanuyos, like the case of Teisha Chanuyos that we mentioned a second ago. This Sanhedrin, or the Dayanim on the Sanhedrin, like Kami Boyalan. It's that's a pasuk in the Torah. But the shail of the Gemara was Ruba the lesser come on. What about it where it's a Ruba the lesser come on? Kigan katan v'ktana. That's the case that we mentioned earlier, and it's the case specifically whether a katan could do yibum or a ktana could be misyabemes. What will be the reason not? Because a saris can't do yibum and an islandess can't do yibum, which means that in the event that a saris or an islandess do yibum, that being pageya be'eshes achshel b'makom mitzvah, and if that's the case, it's a chayve krisus, right? Kamuvin, that would be a very very harbezach, and it's for that reason there's machlekes tanam whether it's shaykh for a katan and a ktana to do yibum or not. Bottom line is, we know that the Shitas HaChachamim al Kopanim, we'll see more about this later, but the Shitas HaChachamim is that a katan could do yibum and a ktana could be mesyabemes, and the reason is because you go by the roiv that most ktanim are not going to be srisim and most ktanois are not going to grow up to be an islandess. Thus, you see, you go by the roiv even though the roiv is less a kaman. So Zach the Gemara Avad, the fact that roiv is mevaris fake is when I could see the roiv ruba dis kaman, that's pshita. But the shaylas, what about a ruba the less a kaman? Zach the Gemara Amar Rabbi Lazar, and really before the words Amar Rabbi Lazar, it should say Simin Zman Shvach Mechanish. So what's this simin? Believe it or not, it's a simin for 10 Amayram. It's 10 letters, 10 Amayram. And these 10 Amayram are going to be the 10 answers to this kasha. So whereas as related to Chazaka, Minaha Milsa, the Amr Rabbanan Oiski Milsa Chazaka, there was one makar, but a kasha no less on that makar. That didn't seem like we really got out of too smoothly. When it comes to roiv now, the Gemara is going to bring like pachis from 10 makars, which by the way is the reason that the roiv part of the sugya is longer than the chazaka part of the sugya. It's not because roiv is more lumdish, but the reason the roiv part of the sugya is longer is simply we have more sources. We have 10 Mekairis to this idea of Minaha Milsa the Amr Rabbanan Zilbas Ruba. Again, Ruba the Lesa Kama, because Ruba the Isa Kama, we're not having this conversation. That's a pasuk in the Torah. Achrei Rabim Lahatis. Either way, Zok the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Laz. Rabbi Laz is the first pshat. He's the Zion of Zman. You want to know what the Makar is? We learn it out from the head of the carbon oil. The Amakra, the pasuk says, we know that the carbon oil was unique. We'll try to do this quickly. In that the carbon oil had a special mitzvah called nituach. Hefshet v'nituach. What's nituach? The oila had to be chopped up in a certain way. Now, Chazal said, oisol in a sachem, v'lo in a sachehel in a sachem. One of the halachas in the mitzvahs nituach is, you cut it once, but you can't dice it. You can't make it into very, very small pieces. Now, part of the mitzvah of nituach was to sever the head of the carbon oil. Being that you're makayim a mitzvahs nituach when you sever the head, and there's a din of that means you can't cut the head a second time. Tainas, Rabbi Loaz, is a little bit of a problem with that. Because one of the Yudches Trefis that are discussed in Perek Elu Trefis is that if there's a hole in the membrane surrounding the brain, that would make the animal into a trefa. Now, you can't go and chop up the head and cut through the skull to see whether or not there's a nekev in the krum of the mayach as it relates to this carbon oila. And the reason is because there's a din of v'nitach oisel in sacher, oisel in a sachim, v'loy nesachel in a sachim. And if that's the case, that poses a big problem. Because you can't put a treifa on the mizbech. How do you know this animal's not a treifa? Let's explain this a little bit better. When you have shchitas chulin, so you shecht an animal, so you have to be baitik to yud chestrefis. One of the bedikas are, you have to make sure there's no nekev in the krum of the mayach. But when it comes to the carbon oil, where there's a mitzvah of nituach, and part of mitzvah of nituach is to cut off the head, which means you can't cut the head a second time. You have no way of doing this bedika. So how do you have a right to put it on the mizbeach? Maybe it's a treifa. Said Rabbi Loza, elamishum damina zil basaruba. Probably because you go basaroiv. What's the roiv? Roiv animals are not treifas. Bottom line is, you see over here that there's a roiv. Now, those roiv animals that are not treifas, are they all in front of you? Are you looking at them? Of course not. That's a ruba the lesser, come on. That's not like the Sanhedrin. That's not like the Teisha Chanuyas. So you see clearly that you go bust and ruba the lesser, come on. But the Gemara says, I don't think there's a hechrach. Mimai. Maybe what the Kohen would do is, after he severed the head of the oila, he would cut it again and cut it in a way that he'd be able to see. What's the problem? I thought you're not allowed to cut it a second time. Could be. Maybe that's only an issue if you're going to sever it 100%. But in the event that it's still going to be attached a little bit less, at that point it's not going to be an issue. I mean that at that point it's not going to be an issue. That would be the eitzah. So Rabbi Loza said, what's the makar that you go bust ruba the lesser? Come on, you learn it out from the roish of the oila. How do you know that it's not a treif? You can't cut it. That's what you would usually do. Oh, must be Basaruba, the lesser kaman of roiv animals are not being treifas, but the Gemara was doich. It could be you can cut it. Isn't that a violation of doing a double nituach? That's only if you're mechatach legamri. But if you're not going to be mechatach legamri, then it's not going to be an issue. Mar brei Ravina, Mar sagt the Gemara, Mar brei Ravina. That's the mem of Zman. He said a second shot. Asim mishviras etzem bepesach. You learn it out from the halacha that you're not allowed to break the bone of a carbon pesach. One of the Torah says etzem leisish beru. But if that's the case, v'neicha shemenikov krum shal mayach. Carbon pesach, you have the same exact issue. It says ve'etzem leisish beru. But you can't just go ahead and break bones. It means you can't crack the skull of the carbon pesach. Now, if that's the case, you have no way of doing the bedika on the mayach to make sure there's no nekev in the krum. So how do you have a right to go be makdir now the carbon pesach? Maybe it's a tray for again, it's the same makar, but it's not from the head of the oil, it's from the head of the carbon pesach. But the bottom line is, you see, you go basarov, that animals are not treifas, even though it's ruba the last come up. The Gemara says, maybe you do an inspection. There is some diagnostic that's done on the animal to make sure that nothing happened to the krum of the mayach. How are you going to do it? You're not going to break the bones. How are you going to get into the mayach? The answer is, you're going to put a burning coal there. You're going to burn the bone. And that's okay. I can't break it, but I can burn it. Yes, the Tanya we learned to the Bryce. Mechatech begidin. If somebody is mechatech not the atzamos of the Pesach, but the gidim, or the hasayrif ba'atzamos, that's what we need. If somebody goes ahead and he burns the atzamos, ain't by mishum shviras etzem. There's no problem with shviras etzem. The bottom line is there is in Eitzah. Rav Nachman by Yitzchak Amar. This is the Nun of Zman. I have a third makar. Asya me'alya. It's learned out from the tail, Rashi says, of the Shlomim and the Chatas. Amar Rachman, the Torah says, Chel by ha'alya temima. The Torah says that when it comes to the sheep, right, the keves or the ayil of a Shlomim and achatas. So part and parcel of what went on the mizbeach as part of the haktara was the alya, right? It was the tail that was all included in it. Now it says that it had to be tamima, which means that you couldn't just break it. What's the problem? one of the bedikas that the boidik, the sheikhet, has to do when he shechts an animal is he has to go through the chut hashedra and he has to make sure that there's no issues. Now the chut hashedra is the spine. It goes all across the back of the animal and it goes all the way into the alya. That's how far it goes. Now if you're not let to break the area of the alya, so that area, that's the alya, is going to have a cheluk of the chut hashedra, and that cheluk of the chut hashedra, you're not going to know whether there's a treifa or not. So hey, let it put it on the mizbeach. You're being makter without doing the full pedika. Must be there's a roiv. What's the roiv? Again, roiv animals are not treifas. It's a ruba, the less come on, but at the end of the day, you see it's something that you're allowed to do. But the Gemara says, maybe you'll tell me. Maybe what you're going to do is when you cut the alya, you're going to cut it all the way on the bottom of the chut hashedra. Rashi explains this, that we're going to see in Perikei L'Treifus, the chut hashedra is divided into three groups. The lowest group is the most kuladik as it relates to the laws of treifus. So as long as you're going to cut it all the way on the bottom, so over there, Ayin Rashi, you're not going to have to worry about there being an issue. But the Gemara says it's not an eitzah anyways. And the reason is because it says mefurish in the pasuk regarding the chilbay ha'alya tamima that it has to be lu'umas he'otza. That's the area that it has to be. And what does that mean? It means next to the nidin, next to the kidneys, right? The kidneys in Chazal are yoyatzois. So it has to be in that area. That's what's learned out from ha'atzah. The bottom line is a little higher up. A neck of already is going to knock it out. So the bottom line is that's not going to be an eitzah. So the Gemara says, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, this is my makar. My makar is I learned it from the aliyah of the chatas and the shlom. How you let it put on the mizbech? It has to be tamima. You're not doing any bedika to make sure that there's nothing wrong with the chut hashedra, and don't tell me you cut it all the way on the bottom where there's no issue anyways, because it has to be l'umas ha'atzah. Says the Gemara, the Gemara says, I don't know if that's an issue. Maybe la'olam you're going to open up the alya, and you're going to look at the chut hashedra, you're going to make sure there's no problem over there. Why do you think it's not an option? Because it's tamima. Maybe hani mili, could be that's only an issue. That's only if you cut the gamri. Less some, but like we mentioned earlier, that to the extent that it's life, to the extent it's going to be a little bit of a touch, at that point it won't be an issue. Either way, this concludes the first of the three words that we used in our Simmons. Man, by the way, if you take a look at the Chasam Sofer al Hashas right here in Chulin, he makes a big deal of that. The reason the Simmon was divided into three words, because even though it's 10 Makairis, but it's three groups of Makairis, Ayin Sham. But the first three, it's pretty obvious what they have in common. They're all Kachim Diga Makairis. The first one was, we learn it from the Rosh of the Karban Oila. The second one is, we learn it from the Rosh of the Karban Pesach. The third one was, we learn it from the Aliyah of the Chatas and the Shlomim. And notice, by the way, we would doicha all three. At the end of the day, there's no real raya from the Rosh of the Oila. What was the raya? You're not going to be able to chop it up a second time. How do you know that there's no issue with the krum of the mayach? Maybe you'll open it a little bit, but it'll still be attached. Etzem leisish berubai. How do you know that there's no issue with the krum of the mayach of the Karban Pesach? Maybe you're going to put a burning hot coal, and we know if somebody's served that samis, that's not an issue. The aliyah, how do you know there's no problem with the chut hashedra all the way on the bottom? Again, maybe, even though it says tamima, but you'll keep it attached, but at the same time you'll open it enough that you'll be able to look inside. The bottom line is the three Makairis were all kachim digim Makairis, and all three of them were nitcha. That's the Gemara. Second group, Shvach. Rav Sheishes berei the Ravidi's dishon of Shvach Amar Asim Egla Arufa. We learned it from the Egla Arufa. The Amar Rachman of the pasuk says Ha Arufa Kishehi Shleima. It says in the Torah Ha Egla Ha Arufa. The way Rashi learns this is that the animal after its Arufa has to be the same ha'egla. And just like the ha'egla had to be a sholem, so too, after that rufa, besides for the fact that it's, beheaded, right? I mean, other than that, it's shlema, but again, ha'rufa kshi shlema, tahava teaches me that it has to be a sholem. What's the problem? That means you're not doing any bedikis to figure out whether or not it's a treifa. Isn't that a problem? You're going to tell me my nafkamino. Whoa, 1 second. I understand why treifa was a sugya when you were dealing with the head of the oil, the head of the Pesach, or the aliyah of the chatas and the shlomim. But the egla rufus, who said the egla rufus is not allowed to be a treifa? The Gemara says no, it has to be, because Amri devei Rabbi Yanai kaparik siba kakachim. It says kapar lamchi Yisrael, and we learn from there a lot of halachas. One of the halachas is that it has to be mamish like kachim, meaning it's not allowed to be a treifa. So the bottom line is from there you have a makar. Rabbi Bar Shela. Rabbi Bar Shela is the next pshat. He said, Asya mi para aduma. It's learned out from the para aduma. Dam Rachmana, the pasuk says, v'shachat v'saraf. It says regarding the para aduma, the kohen shechted it, and then he went ahead and he burnt it. And we learned from the juxtaposition between the shechita and the sreifa, the match shechitasa kishehi shleima, just like the shechita had to be done when it was a shalim, af sreifasa kishehi shleima. So the sreifa had to be done when it was a shalim. Now, if that's the case, that means if it has to be a shleima, you're not doing any diagnostics. L'chayra, how do you know it's not a treifa? Elalam mishon durin zilbasa ruba, must be because of gobasa revechitema. My nafkamini, you're going to tell me again, we're dealing with the paradum, we're not dealing with a carbon. So if you're not dealing with a carbon, who said it's not let it be a treifa? Says the Gemara, no, because we all know chatas kayrachman. We know Torah calls the paraduma the carbon chatas, and just like a chatas has to not be a treifa, so to the paraduma wouldn't be a treifa either. So the Gemara now brought 2 additional makayos, we're up to 5 already, if you're keeping score. The first one was Rav Sheshes Berei de Ravidi. He's the shin of Shvach. He learned it from Egla Arufa. The next one was Rabba Bar Rab Shela. He's the Beis of Shvach. What were their Makairis? Their Makairis were from the Egla Arufa and the Para Aduma, respectively. If you take a look at Tosfos, Dibra Maschel, Asya me Egla Arufa, Tosfos asks, I don't understand. He says, when the Gemara asked the Kasha or when Rabbi Lazar brought his Makar from Reisha Shal Oyla, and when the Gemara brought a makar from the aliyah of the chatas and the sham, the Gemara was doichet. Because the Gemara said, even though the roish of the oil you're not let it cut, but doesn't mean you can't do an inspection. Because not cutting means you can't sever it. You can't make it 2 pieces. But maybe you could cut it layif, the Gemara used, right? That was the lashon. Maybe you have a way to look in. And the same is true regarding the aliyah. And because that, the Gemara was doichet. Freik Tosfos, how come when the Gemara brings the makar from Egla Rufa, where again, it has to be shleima, or when we learn from Para Aduma where it has to be shleima, why didn't the Gemara make the same dichoy? That la'olam, what you're going to do is you're going to cut it, and you'll make sure that there's no issues with treifas, side with Egla Rufa, side with the Para Aduma, and you're just going to inspect it, and that's it. Why was it a dichoy for the roish of the oila and for the aliyah of the chatas and the shlomim, and it's not a dichoy for the Egla Rufa, and it's not a dichoy for the Para Aduma? So Tosfos says in Pshat, it's very simple. Tosfos says that when the Torah says that you're not allowed to make the head of the oila not into a shalim. What does it say? It says you're not allowed to cut it. So as long as it's attached, it's not considered nituach. It's not considered cut. As it relates to the aliyah tmima, the Torah says it has to be tmima. As long as it's attached, that's enough for it to be tmima. By the egla arufa, what was the drasha? The drasha was ha egla ha arufa. That after it's arufa, it still has to be the zelba egla. That egla at that point wasn't hanging on a thread. It was a perfect egla. So now it would have to be a perfect egla. When the drasha of Paraduma was mentioned. What was it? V'shachat v'saraf. B'shas the sreifa, it has to be exactly the way it was at the time of the shechita. At the time of the shechita, it had to be perfect. Otherwise, it's about mum. It's no shaykhis. So there, we're being medamit to the way it was when it was alive. So you can't say that you're going to cut it and carve it up, but you'll make sure it's still attached a little bit. No. That's fine to make it not nituach. That's fine to make it that it's still considered tmima. But if you want it to be ha egla ha arufa, if you want it to be v'shachat v'saref, then you would need it to be literally the same. So Tosfos, that's why the Gemara wasn't able to be doicha this in the same way. Rav Acha bar Yaakov Amar, Rav Acha bar Yaakov and Acha, that is the ches of Shvach. And this is the second time we have Rav Acha bar Yaakov in today's daf, featured very prominently in the Chazaka part of today's daf. Now we have him as one of the 10 pshatim in the Sugya of Rav as well. But either way, what did he say? Asi misar mishtalech. It's learned from the Sar Mishlach. Come on, the Torah says that the Kohen Gadol would take the 2 seirim, and we learn from this shneim shavim, that they had to be exactly the same, right? They had to be perfectly the same. Now, perfectly the same means the Sar Lashem had to be not a treifa because it's going on the Mizbeach. So that would mean that this Sar Lazazel also had to be not treifa. Now, Dilmachabi not treifa, who how do you know that the Sar Lazazel is not a treifa? And the way Rashi explains, Bishlema the Sar Lashem, you'll do a bedika, the way you always do a bedika. But as it relates to the Sar Lazazel, there's not going to be an opportunity to do a bedika, as we'll see in a second. And if that's the case, how do you know it's not a treifa? Zok the Gemara, Elalav must be Mishum that there's something called Roiv, and we go Basar therefore it's going to be okay. You'll tell me, you're going to tell me who said that Sar Lazazel is not allowed to be a treifa. Now we just said, I told you why, it's because they have to be shava. But the way the Mefarshim explained the Gemara's kasha is that maybe when we say they have to be shava, it doesn't mean in the treifa sense. Maybe it has to be that they're shava b'mara, like the Gemara says, shava b'koima, but maybe they don't have to be shava as it relates to this nakuda. But the Gemara says, I hear, that would maybe be a plausible dichoy. But at the end of the day, there's a halacha that the Sar Lazazel had to be right to be the Sar Lashem. And to the extent it was ever nisbar that it was a treifa, well, that would mean that it wasn't kosher to be the Sar Lazazel. That's how you know it had to be the Sar Lazazel. So it's maybe not from the fact of Shnei Seirim that you could be doicha, but in Gerel Kovel Lazazel El B'Davar Roy L'Shem, at the end of the day, that's not something you could be doicha. V'chitem, you'll tell me, okay, what's the greatest problem? Maybe the Batkinale, maybe you'll go ahead and you'll do a badika. By the time we went into the Mishnah, there was no opportunity to do badika, because by the time it was halfway down the mountain, at that point it was completely whacked from all sides. It was already Evarim, Elamai. You see from here that you must go Basarayv, and this concludes the second category of Mekairis, of how you know you go Basarayv, and these are all Me'inyan Le'inyan Ba'Isinyan. Mamish, in the world of Reit, incredibly Me'inyan Le'inyan Ba'Isinyan. These are three types of karbanis, that are not really karbanis. What are they? They're the Egla Arufa, the Para Aduma, and the Sar La'azaz. It's fascinating. So we have the Karban Oila, the Karban Pesach, and the Chatos and the Shlomim. That was the first three. And then we have their counterparts to a degree, and that is, we have the Egla Arufa, we have the Para Aduma, and we have the Sar Mishtalech. Either way, we're up to the last group called Mechanish. Zok the Gemara, Rav Mari Amar, that's the man. Asya, you want to know what the Makar is, and this, by the way, needs a drum roll, because this is by far the most famous of all the Makaris. You want to know what the source is, that you go Basirai Baruba the Lesa Kaman, we learn it, Mimaka Ava V'imai. We learn it from the fact that it says in the Torah, Maka Ava V'imai Mois Yumas. Dam Rachmana Katle, Torah says, maybe his father's not really his father. Must be you go Basarayv. What's the Rayv? Right till now, all the Rayvs were, there's a Rayv that an animal's not a treifa, every single one. This is the first time we have a different Rayv. That Rayv Bilos Achrabal must be Al Kapanim. Now, all those Rayv Bilos is less to come on, so you see clearly, you go Basarayv, Afilu Beruba, the less to come on, but the Gemara says, maybe the only time a person can be over Maka Avavimai is if when he was conceived, his father and his mother were Chavish Bebeisa Asurim Tzazamin. So over there's no suffix that the father is the father. But Enochinami, if that wasn't the case, even though Roy Bilas Achrabal, maybe you don't go Basarayv. But the Gemara says, Afilu Hachi. Even if the father and the mother were chavish bebeisa asurim, you'd still have to come onto the roiv, and the reason is because ein apotropos la'arayas. At the end of the day, you can never be meman and apotropos to make sure there's no arayas. The point is because it's nafshe shel adam echamdasan or misavasan, and even if it's bebeisa asurim, you always have to be choshid. Maybe it's the shomer. Rashi says maybe the shomer gave reshus to somebody else. The bottom line is ein apotropos la'arayas. That in and of itself would not be an eitzah, and it's for that reason. Says the Gemara, Rav Mari told us that you want to know the Makar, that you go Basirai Baruba the Lesa Kaman. It's learned out from Makkah of Avim. Rav Kahana Amar, he's the Chaf of Mechanish, or Kaf of Mechanish. Asya Mehurgas and Nefesh. You learn it out from every right sect. Amar Rachmanu, the Torah says Katle. If somebody kills somebody's Chai Misa, maybe the person that he killed was a treifa. How do you know that he killed a person? It's not somebody, it's a Hurgas, a treifa. You're not chayav misa. So how can you ever give a person misa's best? Now we're going back to the roiv of people are not treifas. Elamai must be because, right? A person is nishkain treif. You'll tell me the batkina, maybe do a bedika, maybe do an autopsy. Now this line of Gemara, by the way, obviously today's not the sugya for this, but this next line of Gemara is from the grosser lines in Shas. Says the Gemara, maybe you'll tell me you do a bedika, hakamenavel. What do you mean? There's nivel ames. You can't do an autopsy. Maybe you're going to tell me mishum ibud neshama dahai. Ninavle. Maybe you'll tell me that I understand ordinarily we don't do an autopsy, but over here, if you do an autopsy and you find out that the person that was killed was a treifa, you're going to save a life. So maybe for that you would do it. And it sounds a little bit like the Gemara hears this, right? Which is where this famous sugya of maybe there being times where it's okay to do an autopsy plays itself out. Because the Gemara doesn't answer the kasha. The Gemara just says, even if you did that, Even if you did that, Shema b'makom sayif nakav. You could always say that even if we would find out that the person was okay, you did the autopsy, and as far as we know, there was nothing there. But maybe he really had a hole in a part of his body that would render him a treifa. How come you don't see? Because it's in the makom of the nekav. Punk, this guy went ahead, it was b'makom nekav nakav, right? Bringing us back to daf tes. But the bottom line is, maybe that's what happened. Elamai, why we not chayish for maybe b'makom nekav nakav? The teretz must be because we go basaroiv. Thus, we see there's a concept of Ravina. Ravina said, Asi me'edim zoyim. And you want to know what the makar is? And this is the nun of mechanish. It's learned out from Edim Zoyim. One of the pasuk says, so what would be if you had two Edim that said Edim said somebody killed somebody, and then they were found to be Edim Zoyim? So what does it say in the Torah? Now they're going to be Chayim Miso. Maybe the person they were saying Edis about is a treifan. Obviously you go basaroy. Now maybe you're going to do a bedika. Right? So you're going to chop this guy up? So the Gemara says, Vatanya, that's not an option. Because Berebi said, who's Berebi? So either Ayin Red Bites or just Ayin Rashi is also good. But either way, Loi Hargu Nerogin, Hargu Nerogin. We know that the only time you say Kashazamam is if it was Kashazamav like Kasharasa. If the person was killed already, where you can technically, theoretically, maybe do an autopsy, it sounds like, again, the Gemara is entertaining the possibility of the autopsy. But the bottom line is that then there would be no kashazam. So when you're doing kashazam, obviously the person's alive. And if the person's alive, then obviously you can. It's interesting, in today's day and age, there is a mahalach of doing different diagnostics where, through CAT scans and MRIs and X-rays, there are ways potentially to know whether a person's a treifa or not a treifa, which is interesting how it would impact all this. But the bottom line is the Gemara says there's no way to do a bedika on a live person, and if that's the case, obviously that's not going to be an eitzah. And then finally, we're up to the 10th pshat. Right? Who said the second to last pshat, the 9th pshat? Ravina was the one that said, it would have been Geshmak if it was Rav Achabrei the Rava, but it's Ravina, right? So Ravina said the 9th pshat. Who says the 10th pshat? It's who always gets the last word in a sugya. Rav Ashi said, Asya mishchita atzma. You learn it from shchita alein. Amar Achmana, the Torah said, shchit ve'achol. You're allowed to shechten v'leicha shem b'makom nekev kosh achid. Maybe it happened b'makom the nekev. How do you know the shchita was a good shchita? Was going to do bedikas? Maybe punk, the shchita happened, and maybe there was a nekev in the veshet or in the kana, and punk, you went ahead and you did a shchit in that place. Must be that you go basaroy. We're going to hit the pause. We're not finished, but we're going to hit the pause button for 1 second. And this concludes the last 4 of the Makairis, which were Maka Ava Ve'imai, Ahirigas HaNefesh, Edim Zoymimin, who said Edus about someone that was Harigas HaNefesh, and then Rav Ashi, who said you learn that from Shchita Atzma. So the bottom line is, what is the Makar that you go basaroy? Ruba de Isa Kaman? Oh, that's easy. That's a pasuk in the Torah. Achi Rabim Lahatis. It's not the question. The question is, what's the makar that you go basaroy when it comes to Ruba de Lesa Kaman? The answer is Man Shvach Mechanish. Either it's learnt out from the nituach of the head of the carbon oil. It's learnt out from the etzem leisish beruboy and the head of the carbon pesach. It's learned out from the haktor of the aliyah of the chatas and the shlamim. It's learned out from the eglaruf of the paraduma, the sarah mishtaleach. It's learned out from the fact that makav yima yumas v'duma lavavivu. It's learned out from someone that's harigas hanefesh. Why does he have a chayiv misa? Maybe the person was a treifa. From the fact that Edom Zoyim get misa's bezin for being made on somebody kashazama and v'loy kasharasa, that a person was a harigas hanefesh. Or it's learned out from every shchita. How do you ever sit down and eat a piece of meat? B'chayra. Why you're not concerned that maybe the animal was a treifa. But there's one postscript, which is critical mamash. Because if you stopped right here, we'd walk away from this Gemara just on the Daf Yomi level Amaratzim. So we need to read the next words of the Gemara, because this is a very, very important end of the story. And that is Amar Rav Ashi. Not surprisingly. Amrita l'shmaita k'rein Rav Kahana. I said over this halach to Rav Kahana. By the way, Rav Kahana was Rav Ashi's Rebbe. So Rav Ashi said, Amrita l'shmaita k'meid Rav Kahana. V'amrila, some say that Rav Ashi said that Rav Kahana said k'meid Rav Simi. He said over to Rav Simi, V'amar le. Now V'amar le is the girsa according to the second pshat, right? If Rav Ashi is relating what Rav Kahana told Rav Simi, then he's saying V'amar le. But if Rav Ashi's relating what I told Rav Kahana, and now what Rav Kahana told me, it's not V'amar le, it would be V'amar li. If you take a look on the side of the Gemara, Agoyis Mitziyunim, some talk change the Gersa, but either way, V'amar le, V'dilma, Heicha de Efsher, Heicha de lo Yefsher, lo Yefsher. How do you have a right to learn from Not just Rav Ashi's pshat, even though Rav Ashi is the one that's talking. But if you look in the Mefarshim, really, all 10 of the pshatim. How do you have a right to learn from any of these Mekayres the idea of Ruba the Lesser Kaman? In all of these situations, if you're not going to go Basarayv, you're going to be stuck, right? If you're not going to go Basarayv, so you won't be able to be Makriv the Carbon Oila, and you won't be able to be Makriv the Carbon Pesach, and you won't be able to do the Haktara properly with the Chatas and the Shlamim, and you're going to have an issue with Yegla Rufa, right? Just go through each one. You're going to have a problem with the Para Aduma. You'll never have a Sar Mishtaleach. The mitzvah in the Torah, or the Isser in the Torah, that's not something that's going to apply. You'll never be able to give somebody Misas Bezin in the event that it was Harigas HaNefesh. You won't have Edom Zaymimin when it comes to Edom that were made, and Shchita, you'll be vegan for the rest of your life. Right? So all of these situations were situations where there is no way out. But Tainas the Gemara, maybe B'chai Gavna, where it's Efsher, where you don't have to come to arrive. Maybe B'chai Gavna, where there's a Mahalach, where there's another way to go about this. Maybe in such a situation, you don't go Basarayv. And he followed up with a very sharp punchline. If you're going to tell me not that way, we were waiting for this. The Rab Meir, the Chayish L'miyuta. We know Rab Meir is Chayish L'miyuta. And by the way, what does it mean Rab Meir is Chayish L'miyuta? Rab Meir doesn't hold the V'roiv. It's a pasuk in the Torah. After learning the Sugi, we understand a little bit better. Ruba the lesser, come on. Over there, Rab Meir is Chayish L'miyuta. Are you going to tell me in Rab Meir's world, you're not allowed to eat basa? You'll say, maybe, yeah. Maybe all Rameir's Chassidim were vegetarians and vegans. But can't be, because Pesach v'kotchin ma'yikol. There's a mitzvah to eat from the carbon Pesach. There's a mitzvah v'achlois mashakupa b'hem. These are mitzvahs deiraisa, and there's no way Rameir can knock out those mitzvahs deiraisas. Ella, what do you have to say? Heicha de efshe efsher, heicha de lo yefsher lo yefsher. This is hachanami. Heicha de efshe efsher, heicha de lo yefsher lo yefsher. So Rav Ashi said, Amrita l'shmaita kamed Rav Kai. I told him over this whole shmuz, and he said that there's no way there's a raya from here, because I could always tell you heicha de efshe efsher, heicha de lo yefsher. Where Rameh is chaylik in these cases, you know he's masking. Where's he chaylik? Heichad the efsher. Okay, so you have no makar then to heichad the efsher. Okay, so what's the makar then? It's amazing. You see how the Rav part of Sugya ended the same way as the Chazaka. It ended with a cliffhanger. It ended with a kasha. So then what is the makar? So how then do you know that you go basar? We went through 10 makaras. I think if you ask the man on the street, how do you know you go bust Ruba the Lesser Kaman, he'll probably tell you Mak Avivim Moisumas, right? By the way, it's only one of 10 Makaris, but it doesn't even sound like that's the Makaris. If you take a look at Rashi, Rashi says as follows: Elavadai. It's the first narrow line on the top of Yudezam and Aleph. Halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Hades samchina and aruba afila heichad efsher. Inami. Alternatively, it says in the Torah achirabam lahatos, and that's mashma bein ruba isa kamon bein ruba the lesser kamon the maishna hai mehai. So Rashi, at the end of the day, you want to know what the makar is to ruba the lesser kamon. The makar is either it's halacha l'Moshe Misinai or it's learned out from achrei rabam lahatos v'lo shna ruba the isa kamon versus ruba the lesser. Come on, and this that everyone always quotes Maka Ava Ve'imai is mamish mufrich finale zaitin. Number one, it's only Rav Mori's pshat, right? There's 9 other pshatim in terms of what the makar is, and even all 10 of the pshatim at the end of the day were nitcha, because all you see from there is heicha the lo yefsher. Okay, so where it's ever lo yefsher, it's lo yefsher, but heicha the efsher, you would have no makar. The place where a mayor and the Chachamim battled out the shayla of whether we go Basaruba the Lesser and we don't go Basaruba the Lesser Kaman, thus hotnished with Chulin Daf Yud Aleph at the end of the day. And what really is the Makar? Either it's learned out from Allah L'Moshe Misinai, or it's learned out from Achri Rabbim Lahatois, and the Gemara's chilik betchilas asugya between a Ruba the Isa Kaman and Ruba the Lesser Kaman after further review is really overruled either way. So as it relates to raid, and again, this is obviously a daf that, Baruch Hashem, we've come back to over the years so many times, but I think it's kedai to speak out one Dover Yisaidi, and this is something that we've spoken about in the past, aber the aim based medrash below chiddush, and that is, so the daf was made up of 2 parts, right? The first part of the daf, albeit the shorter part of the daf, was Minaha Milsa the Amr Rabbanon Oiki Milsa Achazake. The second part of the daf, the longer part of the daf, was Minaha Milsa the Amr Rabbanon Zil Basaruba. What emerged from the end of the second part of the daf, which is something that we already knew, is that not everybody even holds that you go Basaruba the lesser kamon. Rameir, elokod meir aneni, is chayish l'miyuta. There's a Tosfos, Dibra Maschul Pesach v'kotchem ha'ikol ha'meimer, here in Daf Yud Beis Amud Aleph, where Tosfos discusses whether a meir that's chayish l'miyuta is a midairaisa that is chayish l'miyuta, or is only a din d'Rabbanan that is chayish l'miyuta. Ayin Sham, maybe we'll talk about that tomorrow. But for now, everyone knows that Rameir's shita is that he's chayish l'miyuta. The Pri Megadim, in his Sefer Rosh Yosef on Masechtes Chulin, right here on our sugya Daf Yud Amud Beis, he makes the following observation. He says, we know, Chazal say, Ruba v'chazaka, Ruba adif. So anytime there's a face-off between the first part of today's daf and the second part of today's daf, you have this mano a mano between the idea of oiki milsa achazake and the idea that we're azal basta ruba. The rule is ruba v'chazaka ruba adif. Roiv is always better than chazaka. Zok the Pri Megadim. If that's the case, it should come out that Rameir, who doesn't go basta roiv, Rameir, who's chayish l'miyut, at the very least midrabanan, kol shekain, he shouldn't go basa chazaka. And freik the Pri Megadim, hayitachein loy ro'inu v'loy shamanu, that there should be a shitas Rameir in Shas that doesn't go basa chazaka. Azoi is ma'ir the Rosh Yosef, and he says l'chura in cheshbon of the sugi, that's what should come out, because Ruba v'chazaka, Ruba adif, and Rameir doesn't go basa roiv. So if he doesn't go basa roiv, Kal v'chaim, you shouldn't go basa chazaka either. Over the years, we've mentioned this ha'ara from the Pnei Yeshua in his Kuntrus Achra in the first parak of Masechtes Ksubas. And the Pnei Yeshua, when he asks the kasha, he doesn't just say that it loy shamanu v'loy ro'inu, that there should be a shitas Rameir that doesn't go basa chazaka. He says it's in the Mefurish Gemara in Eruvin Daf Lamed Hei Amud Beis, where Rameir goes basa chazaka to meikara. So you see, Rameir does go basa chazaka, and he's not chayish quote unquote l'miyuta to say that we shouldn't go basa chazaka. Freik the Pnei Yeshua, this grace akasha, that how can it be that Rameir is chayish l'miyuta, he doesn't go basa ruba, yet he goes basa chazaka if ruba v'chazaka is ruba adif. So he doesn't hold of the better one, which is right, that he holds of the lesser one, which is chazaka. The emes is, over the years we found that this ha'ara is already mentioned in the Rishonim. And the Hagoyis Mordechai, in the end of Masechtes Yevamis, he is ma'ira this kasha, that why is it that you don't find anywhere that there's a shitas Rameir, that Rameir holds you don't go basa chazaka. But the bottom line is, the ha'ara is that if Rameir is chayish l'miyuta and Rameir doesn't go basa chazak roiv, then l'chayra in cheshmin it should come out that Rameir shouldn't go basa chazaka either. And I was thinking, just lefum riyata, when we learned the Gemara, we mentioned that from Benu Gershon, it's klar. And from Rashi, it's a little bit mashma, that there's a Shitas HaMoiram, Rav Acher Bar Yaakov, who holds that you don't go basa chazaka. And we left it off with a Tmir Gedola. First of all, how could there be a mandama that doesn't hold of chazaka? And befrat, how could there be an Amoira that doesn't hold that you go basa chazaka? How many Mishnayos and Brises, how many Sugis Ashas are predicated on the concept of chazaka? If there's a shitas Rameir who holds that you don't go basa chazaka, the ha'ara from the Pri Megadim and the Pnei Yeshua and the Hagoyis Mordechai, if there would be such a shita, well then Rav Acher Bar Yaakov the Amoira would have a Tana the Messiah. And if that's the case, he could always say, I hold like Rameir. And by the way, this shitas Rameir is a shita, we just went to Gemara on Davav, there Gamliel Beis Dino, he held like Rameir, that's chayish l'miyuta. So it's not a das yochid, there were under Tanam that also were chayish l'miyuta. But the bottom line is, if you're going to tell me that from the fact that there's a shita in the world that's chayish it's muchach, that shita also doesn't go basa chazaka. So we found on Maramak, and we have a shita sandam that doesn't hold that you go basa rav. And maybe that's a yishuv nochin to understand the way Benu Gershom understood Rav Acher Bar Yaakov. The fact that there would be an Amir in Shas that would hold you don't go basa chazaka. But either way, the Gedolei Achronim are not happy with this. And if that's the case, it's ton yishuv. How you talking? How's it possible that Rameir doesn't go basa rav is chayish l'miyuta, yet he does go basa chazaka? So maybe you could say, Ubehektem. Tosfos on Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. It's the second Tosfos on the Yom. Tosfos asks a kasha. The Gemara said, Minah milsa, the Amar Rabbanan oiki milsa achazake. And the Gemara brought him a car. And then the Gemara said, Minah milsa the Amar Rabbanan zil basa ruba. Freitais akasha v'im toimar kivan the amrinan zil basa chazaka. Once we established that you go basa chazaka, kosh came basa ruba. Certainly you should go basa ruba. The ruba v'chazaka, ruba adif. So freitais akasha. Once I have a makar for chazaka de mikara, why do I need a makar for Rav, why don't we say that once I know Chazaka, Ruba v'Chazaka, Ruba Adif, so if Chazaka where it's Rav should work. Meaning, Ruba v'Chazaka, Ruba Adif is a svara l'chayr. Meaning, I know for sure Rav is better than Chazaka. Okay, so perfect. There's your makar to Rav. Once you know Chazaka works, you should know Rav works as well. So I think it's kedai to be Tais inside. It says Tais v'yesh shleima. Dil Rav Acher by Yaakov boy. Dil Kim le Chazaka mikra. That's the Tosfos that we mentioned in the daf. That the Gemara's question is, Aliba de Rav Acher by Yaakov. According to Rav Acher by Yaakov, that didn't have a pasuk for Mina HaMilsa, the Amar Rabban and Oiki Milsa HaChazake. What was his Mekar? This is where the Marsha speaks out. It's a halacha l'Moshe Misinai. And we know Ein L'meidin Min HaHalachas. So even though it's true, if I know Chazaka Kal V'chomer, I know Roiv, but there's a lot of limitations to Kal V'chomer. One of them is, you can't learn Kal V'chomer from something that's halacha l'Moshe Misinai, like Rav Acher by Yaakov, that it's halacha l'Moshe Misinai, Ein L'meidim, and for that reason, it's not going to be okay. But Tosfos Enochinami, according to the Chachamim, according to the Pashtus, that the Makar to Chazaka is from Nigei Batim, and I know it from a pasuk. Ich darf nicht Makar for the concept of Roiv. And the reason is, I know it Kal V'chomer from Chazaka. Which, by the way, let's revisit. What is the Makar to Rav? Maka Avav Imay, that's only one of 10 pshatim. Rashi came out that what is it really? It's not even the one or any of the 10 pshatim. Either it's Halach L'Moshe Misinai, or it's learned out from Achrei Rabbim Lahatis. We have a Tosfos over here tucked away on the top of Yad Alpha Amar Aleph. It could be it's learned out from Chazaka. Because once I know Chazaka, Kal V'chomer, which means Nigei Batim is not only the Makar to Chazaka, Nigei Batim is also the Makar to Rai. Another Ha'ara that I think is Kedai to mention, and that is, we mentioned in the introduction to the Daf, that the Rishonim much a little bit, why is it that we're even talking about Minaha Milsa Damar Rabban and Zilba Seruba? Who come to Rayin Minaha Milsa Damar Rabban and Zilba Seruba? This is a sugya of Chazak, it's not a sugya of Rai. And Rashi says, Ad Kedei Kach, Aidi de Airi b'Minaha Milsa de Chazaka, Noka Namiha. Lefi Tosfos's first teretz, and could be it's very geshmak, because the whole question of Minaha Milson, the Amar Rabban, Zilba Saruba, it was only nischadish, it was only noilad from Rav Acher by Yaakov. So once we mention Rav Acher by Yaakov, who was very much a part of the sugya, so the Gemara, Rav Acher, I didn't know there's such a Rav Acher by Yaakov. You tell me there's a Rav Acher by Yaakov who doesn't hold that there's any Makar in the whole world to Chazaka, Muzin Muzayin, that hasn't going to know it from Allah Moshe B'Sinai. So Kana ben Shayel, Minaha Milson, the Amar Rabban, Zilba Saruba, he must have a new Makar. So it could be the Hemshach, Aliba, the Tosfos is, we mention Rav Acher by Yaakov, Tartan kum to Sarah. That's Tais first teretz. Tais second teretz, he brings from Rabbeinu Chaim, who said that the idea that Ruba Chazaka, Ruba Adav is actually not learned out. It's actually not learned out misvara. What then is the Makar to Ruba Chazaka, Ruba Adav? It's learned out from the Para Aduma. Because the Para Aduma, although there's a Roiv, that the animal's not a treif, as we saw in the Cheshbon, but Tosfos says that Roiv is really going Keneged the Chazaka, and Afilu Hachi, you see that you go Basarayv, that's the Makar to Ruva Chazaka Ruba. But the bottom line is, without going too much into that inami of Tosfos, what Tosfos is saying in the second teretz is that Ruva Chazaka Ruba is not a svara. If it was a svara and chinami, once I know Chazaka, I would know Rav. Ruba Chazaka Ruba, if I goofa learn out from a limud, and at this point in the Gemara doesn't know that limud. After you learn Chulin Daf Yud Aleph, it could be at that point the Gemara wouldn't ask the kasha and a chinami. But the bottom line is, in real time, the Gemara doesn't know yet Para Aduma, thus the Gemara doesn't know Ruba Chazaka Ruba Adif. These are Tosfos two terutzim. Rabbi Chanan, in his Kovitz Ha'aretz, this is in Siman Samech Zayin, Ois Daled, and it's also in Kovitz Shiurim, Mesechtes Bava Basra, it's Ois Ayin Ches, says a teretz nifla to Tosfos Kasha, but I think it requires a tiny bit of an introduction. That is, the Mishnah in Mesechtes Yevamis, Daf Kuf Yud Ches Amar Aleph, discusses the following case. There was a woman that went together with her husband to Medina Sayyam. She comes back from Medina Sayyam without her husband, and she says, Meis Baili, my husband died. So the halach is Tinase Vetitel Ksubasa. She's allowed to get married, she even is allowed to get her Ksuba. Why? I thought Ein Davish of the Erev Pachis Mishnayim. The teretz is Be'edus Isha Hikilu, that an Eid Echad is believed to say Edus, even a woman is believed to say Edus, and a woman's even believed to say Edus about herself. So if a woman would go with her husband to Medina Sayyam and come back without her husband, she'd be believed to say that she's allowed to get married. Zog the Mishnah Vaiter, Abba Vitzarasa Asura. This is Yavamis, right? So in the event that there was a tzara, her husband had another wife, so the tzara would be Asur. And Eid Echad is always believed when it comes to Edus Isha. The reason is because the tzara is back in the day didn't get along very well. In fact, that's the primary reason Rabbeinu Gershom made his cherem forbidding and answering polygamy, but being that we're concerned that this woman doesn't like the tzara, and maybe she wants to get back at her, so maybe she's going and lying because she wants the tzara to get married, have another family, and they're going to all be mamzerim. As a result, she's believed for herself, but she's not believed for the tzara. Zok the Mishnah Vayta, Hoysa Bas Yisrael Kohen. In the event that the tzara was a Bas Yisrael, but the husband was a Kohen, meaning she's someone that, based on how she was born, is not allowed to eat truma. She's a Bas Yisrael, but because she's married to a Kohen, she's allowed to eat truma. Toicha b'truma. Divri Rav Tarfon, she's allowed to continue to eat truma. Meaning, ad kedei kach, Zok the Mishnah, we don't trust this woman, Klapi the Tzara, that we assume that if she wants to continue eating truma, adaita the hachi that her husband's alive, Dan himself is going to be okay. So the Mishnah says that a woman that comes back from Dinah Sayam and says, my husband died, the way we treat it from a halachic perspective is very mechudishtik. We mamish, we tzetel it. As it relates to herself, the halacha is tinaseh v'tital ksubasa. As it relates to the tzara asura ad kedei kach, she's even allowed to eat. Tosfos often says misafgilari. When the Mishnah said that the tzara is allowed to eat truma in the event that she was a Bas Yisrael Kohen, itavke b'truma d'Rabbanon, inami afilu b'truma d'Iraisa. Is it true, dafka for truma d'Rabbanon, is it true even for truma d'Iraisa? No, the Rish said, I'm having a big problem with this Mishnah. How do you go ahead and mamish treat one woman as if she's a pnuya mid'Iraisa, and the other one if she's an eshizish mid'Iraisa? I can't fathom it. Elamai, I think what's going on over here is that avada mid'Iraisa, she has an amanis. Narvaz, there's an idea that maybe she's trying to be makalkal the tzara. So it's for that reason, midrabanan, we're going to be chayish. L'may nafkamina, when the Mishnah says that she's allowed to eat truma, it's only truma d'Rabbanan that she'd be allowed to eat, because midrabanan we're treating her as if she's married. But if she wants to eat truma d'Iraisa, there's no way in the world you can't say that this woman's allowed to get married mid'Iraisa and this woman is 100% not allowed to get married mid'Iraisa. Mid'Iraisa, you have to make up your mind. You can't have a tarti desasment. You could say mid'Iraisa azai, midrabanan azai, and you could even carve out the d'Rabbanan and say we're only being machmer for one and not for the other. But as it relates to saying that mid'Iraisa, she has an amanis for herself, but she doesn't have an amanis for the tzara, misafkilur. But then he says, I'm not sure. Maybe yeah. Efshe yeah. So at first glance, I think I have a raya. And the raya is from the famous case of the Shnei Shvilin. Midi dahava a Shnei Shvilin. What's the case of Shnei Shvilin? There were two roads. One of the roads had tumah. There was so much tumah on that road that if a person walked down that road, it was inevitable, it was not possible that he became tumah. Either way, two people walk down the two roads. And then they were both Isaac and Tyrus anymore. The halacha is that in the event that the two people went to a Rav and asked the Shiloh, but they didn't ask it at the same second, they didn't ask it at the same time, the halacha is that each person is going to be considered to be tar. Why? Because each person was tar. You have a suffix now whether something happened. So you have a cheskes tyra, each person's going to be okay. Zok deri, don't you see from here, even though it's impossible that they're both tar, one of them is for sure but as long as he didn't ask the kasha in the same second, they didn't come to the rub of as achas. So this person's going to walk out tar, that person's going to walk out tar. Now we're handling dine deirais over here, and afilu hachi was splitting the baby in half, and we're saying that you're going to be tar and you're going to be tar. I had to tar to the sasri. Zoktari, you see, I don't care. And if that's the case, Zoktari, as it relates to this Mishnah, it could be, this woman's allowed to get married midday raisa, and this woman is allowed to eat truma that she's still married. I feel midday raisa. But then Tosfos says, but I'm not sure. You know why? Because it's mavur in nida daf beis and chulin daf tes, that when it comes to safik tuma b'shus hayachid tzveikoi tame, in the event you would have two people that have the same safik tuma b'shus hayachid, where it's inevitable that one of these two people that both of these people are tameh. Over there, you wouldn't say Safik Tumah b'shus hayachid tzveikei tameh says they're both tameh. So Safik Tumah b'shus hayachid tzveikei tameh. But what if Reuven and Shimon both have a Safik Tumah b'shus hayachid shayla, and we know for sure one of them is tahar? You can't say they're both tameh because you know for sure that one are tahar. So Tosfos, I'm very confused over here. I'm not sure what to do. I'm thinking that when it comes to deiraisnas, you can't just go ahead and be mechalik. And therefore, Mesafkelari, that when we say tzarasa, if she was Hoysef Astro L'Koyin Teichel B'Truma, maybe it's only Truma D'Rabbanan. But then again, I have Rayz L'Kan L'Kan. On the one hand, from Shnei Shvilim, I see that if they don't ask the question at the same time, they're both going to be assumed to be tar. But then again, from Safek Tumah B'Shus HaYachid, I see that even if they ask the question at different times, being that one of them is for sure tar, you're not going to say Safek Tumah B'Shus HaYachid Tzveik Tameh. So which one is it? That was the Resafek. That's why he wasn't sure what to do over here. The Chef Shmaitza in Shmaitza Zayin Beis says, let me explain to you what's going on in this Tosfos. And let me tell you what the Pesher Hadover is. Zok the Chef Shmaitza. That's klar. That if Bezdin wants to go ahead now and issue a psak, they want to say, I'm telling you this is the way it is. They can't issue a psak, midday raisa, where it's going to be a tartat asasri for two people. And that's why Masaf Kalari, the Re said, I can't hear that this woman stands in front of a court and Bezdin's going to say, you're a Penuya, you can go ahead and get married l'chatchila. You're married 100%, you can even eat Truma Day Raisa. Because how could Bezdin issue a psak, midday Raisa, that's going to affect two people in two contradictory ways? I can't hear such a tzad, and it's for that reason, said the Tosfos, I'm mesupik what should be. Tosfos stellt zu Shnei Shvilim. What do you see in Shnei Shvilim? Bezogt as Azach. Or bezogt the Shmeitz, it's not true. Shnei Shvilim is not a Zushtal. Because what happens by Shnei Shvilim? What happens by Shnei Shvilim is that you have a suffix. I'm not sure, did the person become Tomei? Did the person not come Tomei? What do we say? Oikim milsa chazake. Zogt the Shmeitz. Here's the punchline. Oikim milsa chazake is a psak? It's a Hiraz Bezdin? What's Aikim Milsa Chazake? Aikim Milsa Chazake is, I have no idea what happened. So if I don't know what happened, you leave it the way it is. There's a Chiddush HaTorah, needs a Makar, that you go bust to the status quo. And being that I don't know what happened, I have no idea how it spilled Zechais, how this whole story played itself out, so just leave it the way it is. But when Bezdin Paskins, you're Tahar because I have a suffix if you ever became Tahar, or you're Tahar because I have a suffix if you ever became Tameh, in those situations, Bezdin's not paskining, Bezdin's just saying, I don't know, so leave it the way it is. The fact that Bezdin would have a tarta desasri in terms of how it's going to play itself out, that doesn't bother me, because it's not a Hiraz Bezdin. That's not a Hiraz Bezdin. In fact, Zok Tosfos, if you want a Zushtal to our Mishnah, I'm going to tell you what the Zushtal is. That it's Mavur, neither Daf Beis and Chulin Daf Test, and when it comes to Safek Tumah B'Shus HaYachid Tzveik Tameh, you can't have a tarta desasri, where you have the same case like the Shnei Shvilim, but if it's a Safek Tumah B'Shus HaYachid, you're not going to say that about Tameh. What's the vart? It's because Safek Tumah B'Shus HaYachid Tzveik Tameh is Hilchas Mirila, that we treat the person as if he's Tameh, Keneged is Cheskes Taira, and by the way, Tameh Afilu B'Taira is Vadai, right? Asur Kavadai. So you see, that's a psak. In fact, Kevin, so comes a psak, Mekene Shaban Astira. Zok the Shmeitza, that's what's going on in this Tosfos. Tosfos said, I'm mesupik, whether or not Bezin can paskin that you're Vadai Apnuya, and you're Vadai and Eshes Ish Midei Raisa. On the one hand, I have Shnei Shvilin. On the other hand, I have the two cases of Tum B'Shus HaYachid. But the way the Shmeitzer learns it up in Tosfos, that what Tosfos was saying was that the richtige Zushtel is not Shnei Shvilin. The richtige Zushtel is the case of Safek Tum B'Shus HaYachid. Because Shnei Shvilin, you don't find that Bezin is paskining a case of Tarta Desasri. And the reason is because over there there's no psak. All it is Oikim Milsa Chazaki. Just leave it the way it is. As opposed to it is a psak of Bezdin. You're allowed to get married. Or Safek Tum B'Shus HaYachid, Tzveik Tameh B'Teres Vadai, which that's a psak, that's a din that we're invoking and that we're using. Over there you wouldn't be able to do it when it's a Tarta Desasri. But I'm Mavur Me'ashev Shmeitza. And really this is an Inyan that's Mavur from Kama V'Kama G'dolei Achroinim. Is that Chazaka is fundamentally different than a regular Hiraz Bezdin. When Bezdin says Oikim Milsa Chazake, and when they say let's leave this at its Chazaka de Meikara, the geder of what Bezdin is doing is not that they're saying we're paskening this the way it is. And even though it's a din Torah, and it could be Talacha L'Moshe Misinai, but the geder of the din Torah and the geder of the Talacha L'Moshe Misinai is not that we have a psak b'Torah's vadai that azoyed this, but rather there's a chiddush HaTorah that when we don't know what to do, what we do is we leave it at the Chazaka, right? You know, in the real world, if you don't know what to do, you have to do something, right? In the theoretical world, okay, ich weiß nicht. But Bezdin has to do something. You know, Bezdin's getting paid the big bucks to paskin. They got to do something, but they have no mahalach. There's no hachra. So Alzen nemar chiddush oikim milsa chazaki. That when we don't know what to do, just leave it at the status quo. But chazaka de meikara is not based on any vada'us, it's not a Raz Bezdin, it's not a bearer of any sort. Because how in the world is a chazaka mevar? Right, just think about it for a second. Things change all day, every day, right? So just because something was a way yesterday, that means that's the way it is now? Mechatesi. Not vas. it's not being mevarer. It's just a hanhaga. I don't know what to do. You have a better idea? You have a better idea. Tell me. I'm willing to listen. But the end of the day is if we don't have a better eitzna, so then what we go ahead and what we do is we are oikim milsa chazaki. That's the yisoid of chazaka. Either way, enters Rabbi Chana. Tais fragt Akash and Daf Yud Aleph in Masechtes Chulin that the Gemara says Minoha milsa dam rabbanan zil basa ruba. Fragt Tais vim toimar. Kivan damrin zil basa chazaka, koshkem basa ruba. The ruba v'chazaka ruba adif. Zok Rabbi Chanan. That's true. Roiv is better than chazaka. But you know why Roiv is better than chazaka? The reason Roiv is better than chazaka is because the whole yisoid of chazaka is that when I don't know what to do, oikim milsa chazaka. But to the extent I have a roiv, so I know what to do. And being that I know what to do, so b'chai gavna fakert. That's what I am going to go ahead, and that's what I am going to do. The reason Ruba v'chazaka is Ruba Adif is because chazaka only works but Makom there's no bearer. When there's a bearer, there you go basarai. At the end of the day, from Ruba v'chazaka, Ruba Adif, what you see is that Roiv is a mevar, chazaka is not a mevar. There's no way to learn from chazaka that Roiv would be mevar. From chazaka you could learn. If there's something called a chazaka, there would be something called a Roiv. But at the end of the day, when I have Roiv, the Roiv that I have works better than the chazaka. Because Roiv is mevar and the chazaka is not mevar. And I can't learn Roiv being a mevar, kal v'chomer from chazaka, because chazaka itself is not a mevar. So Zok Rabbi Chanan, that's why, even though we know chazaka, we still need Roiv. You know why we need Roiv? We need Roiv. We need Roiv to know that Roiv has the ability to be mevar. We need Roiv to know that Roiv has the ability to be mevar. And by the way, the reason Ruba v'chazaka, Ruba Adif is gufa, a toitzah from the fact that I know that Roiv has the ability to be mevar. Once I know Roiv is mevar, memela Ruba v'chazaka, Ruba Adif, because the whole yisoid of Ruba v'chazaka, Ruba Adif is that chazaka is when I don't know what to do. A vifel, I know there's a birra called Roiv, so now I do know what to do. But here's the bottom line. The bottom line is Ruba v'chazaka, Ruba Adif is not the taich that the birra of Roiv is better than the birra of chazaka. If that's what it meant, if I know the birra of chazaka, I would know the birra of Roiv. That was Taisus Kasha. Zok Rabbi Chanan is based on this yeshiva charade that really, that the yisoid of Ruba v'chazaka, Ruba Adif is that I only work with chazaka b'makom I have no birr. And that's why when I have a roiv and I have a birr, there's no makom for chazaka. But at the end of the day, roiv and chazaka are fundamentally different. One is a mevarer and the other one is not a mevarer. It's for that reason, even though I would know chazaka, I would have no way of knowing roiv, because how could I learn that something is mevarer Kalvachomer from something that in itself is not mevarer? Al zen nemar, da you love him in adin, li is kenan. Either way, I think it's pashut that I'll pee this Rabbi Chanan and I'll pee this raid. It's miyushiv, the ha'ara gedoyla from the Pri Megadim and Rish Yosef and from the Pnei Yeshua and Kunchas Achra in the beginning of the Ksubis, and it's really a ha'ara from Dagois Martchai, and that is Rameir is Chayesh L'miyuta. That means Rameir doesn't go Basar Roiv. If Rameir doesn't go Basar Roiv, then Kal V'chomer he shouldn't go Basar Chazaka either, because Ruba V'chazaka Ruba Adif. V'lo Shamanu V'lo Re'inu, that there should be a Shittas Rameir that doesn't go Basar Chazaka. The Teretz is Pashat. The Teretz is two different things. There's no Shayches. Where Rameir says I don't go Basar Roiv, what Rameir is saying is I'm chayish l'miyuta. I don't think Roiv has the ability to be mevarer. To me, there's a Roiv, there's still a suffix. Midei sveika loy nafka, midei reisa, midei rabbanan, toises daf yudis. But the bottom line is, at the end of the day, I still see a suffix. But does that mean that in Rameir's world there's no chazaka? Well, if there's no chazaka Rameir's world, what are you going to do when you're not sure what to do? What are you going to do? Rameir also has to have a fallback option. What, in Rameir's court, when they didn't know what to do, they said, I don't know, go kill yourselves, called Olam Gava? I don't think that's what they did. But and the mahalach is that you go basa chazaka. If Roiv and chazaka are both mevarers, and one is a better mevarer, and you find Rameir doesn't hold of the better mevarer, you can't hold of the lesser mevarer. But Roiv and chazaka are two completely different tracks. It's no shayches. It's true Rameir doesn't hold of the birr of Roiv, but Rameir still has to have a parsha of chazaka. That's the yisoid of why Rameir, even though he's chayish l'miyuta, but at the same time Rameir also holds a chazaka l'chayra pashit. I think it's Pashut mamish. Do bezeh p this raid for Rabbi Chanan, which is based on Torah from the Gedolei Achronim. We just mentioned the Shmaitza, but there's other Marmakomis for this as well. That you see this idea that Roiv and Chazaka are completely different. So again, what's the takeaway? Today's daf was really a tale of two dvarim ha'imdim berumay shalaylam. Minaha milsa the Amar Rabbanon oiki milsa chazake, and minaha milsa the Amar Rabbanon zil basar ruba. the end of the day, even though Roiv and Chazaka come together, how much do they come together? Rashi even says, because how could you learn one without the other? The two are mamish one sugya. They're literally one and the same. But at the end of the day, as much as they're one and the same, they're fundamentally different. Because Roiv is mevara the suffix. And Chazaka just says that when in doubt, this is the way you should go about it. But there's zero birr taking place when you have a Chazaka. Is they're both tools that were used by Bezdin midayraisa to go about and to tell the Yid what you're supposed to do b'matzav shel safek. But at the end of the day, they're not one and the same. Ad kedei kach that Rameir doesn't go basar roiv, Ruba de Lesa Kaman, he's chayish l'miyuta, yet Rameir does go basar chazaka, despite the fact that in the world of Roiv and Chazaka, Roiv wins all day, every day. Now the truth is, does Roiv really win all day, every day? No, there's one Chazaka that Roiv is not better than, that's Cheskes Mammon, but the ain't kind of mokum laharach, right? Ain't holchem b'mammon acher haroiv, amoitzu mechaveri all of arai, machlekes Rav and Shmuel. But either way, again, this was just a short, the shortest version possible with a little bit of raid of Chulin Daf Yud Aleph as it relates to the rest of the raid. Again, every single line here is a sugya arucha. By the way, just to appreciate it a little bit better, we had 10 Mekayros to Roiv, right? 10 Mekayros to Roiv. If you look at Tosfos and the Rishonim, they have kashas. How can we mention this? How can we mention that? So let me buy you all the sugyas that we spoke about just from going through the Gemara. If you went through the Gemara with Tosfos, you'd throw in another 25 sugyas, Bali Guzma, and all the raid, and all the different permutations of when you go Basar Roiv, and his Roiv Vada in the Tosfos Rosh and the sugya of Takfu Kayin. This touches on Ksubas Daf Tes and Nida Daf Beis, all the sugyas Chamuris and Shas. But for now, we are going to stop here.